I'm so pleased to be here and to have these two books for company over the past couple of weeks. So our readers this evening are Frances Leviston and Naomi Ishiguro. So welcome to you both. So Naomi's going to read first, and she's going to read from her Tinder Press collection. I guess it's back to front here, but it's called Escape Routes, and it was published this year in February by Tinder Press. It's her debut collection, and Naomi studied in 2017 at the UA, very prestigious UA Creative Writing Masters. She's also worked as a bookseller, and she currently lives in London. She's also cured my fear of rodents. There is a really powerful, she's not going to read from it tonight, so I don't want to spoil it, but there's a really powerful story cycle in her collection about rats. And I made my way through it, and I feel like a new person. But tonight she's going to read about a much bigger animal. She's going to read about a story entitled Bear, and she's going to read a slightly abridged version, but I can just encourage you to go buy this wonderful debut collection, and I look forward to talking to her and Frances later on. So I'll hand it over to you, Naomi. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks so much for the intro, and thank you so much everyone for coming. It's so exciting to be able to do things like this, even in spite of the pandemic and not really being able to travel or go to Cork in person. So yeah, as Sarah said, I'm going to read from my collection. I'm going to read just, I guess, like the first half of a story called Bear. I couldn't really get to the end. It would take me about 20 minutes. So yeah, I'll just kick off. This is Bear. I found myself steering the conversation towards furniture ever more frequently. This question of how we would furnish our new home seemed an easy thing for the two of us to discuss. And now that we were spending so much more time together, shared interests that kept the conversation flowing felt important to cultivate. It was probably these long discussions of ours concerning our future furniture that led to me driving us to a small coastal town one Tuesday morning in May to attend an auction of second-hand household items. I imagined that we might visit plenty of such auctions in our time as newlyweds, and that this specific one might be unremarkable in simply being the first of many. I'm not sure I had many hopes or expectations about what the morning might entail, only perhaps that we might come away with a new sofa so that we would be able to sit together in comfort during our evenings in the living room, instead of always facing across from each other on the upright dining chairs until it was time to go to bed. But if we didn't find that sofa at this particular auction, I reasoned, that was all right. We'd have plenty of time to find the right one. A few unremarkable ornaments and picture frames were brought out before us, none of which my wife or I ventured to bid for. Then the auctioneer's assistant wheeled out a silver trolley, on which was balanced a bear. I say bear. Clearly it wasn't a real bear, come to terrorize the meagre population of this small English town. It wasn't even a taxidermy bear. I only hesitate to use the word teddy, because although that would actually capture his button eyes and furry coat and his too small stitched-in mouth, it would also belie the full extent of the bear, which was considerable. It was as big as me, more or less. Not quite in terms of height, perhaps, but what it lacked in stature, it made up for in girth. If, for instance, someone were to chop me in half at the waist and then set the pieces side by side, that would give you some idea of the overall mass and scale of the bear. I almost laughed aloud in the hush of the auction room as this ridiculous creature was put before the crowd. It seemed absurd, this bear, appearing in this context. A scenario so perfectly attuned to causing merriment that I wondered if the auctioneer had meant it for a joke. And yet no one else in that room seemed to share my amusement. Not even my wife, whom I had thought, up until that moment, had the same sense of humour as I did, exactly. We had laughed together so very often in those heady, hectic days before our wedding. And so I felt obliged to suppress the smile I felt playing on my lips at the appearance of this giant creature. Everybody else around me, the auctioneer and my wife included, was simply watching it in perfect quiet, with expressions that varied from impatience to unconcealed boredom. "One bear," the auctioneer said, "stuffed, soft, In fair to good condition, slight wear on the upper right shoulder, stitching a little frayed on the right leg. Going for £15. I looked behind me, turning in my seat to survey the hall and see which of these small town people might go so far as to bid for such a monstrous thing. Their expressions, however, remained as listless as ever. No one? No one at all? No one amongst you who would bid £15 for such a magnificent bear as this? The auctioneer's voice echoed in the hall. £12 then. For £12. Giant stuffed bear going for £12. I craned around in my seat again to study the hall behind me, feeling sure some poor soul would respond to this new starting price. It was just too awkward, seeing that creature slumped there, brought before us on its trolley, heavy head lolling and limbs akimbo. Surely someone would crack. And then I felt movement in the chair beside me, and my wife was raising her hand. For £12, yes, to that lady in blue. I turned to my wife, expecting her to smile, to show some sign that she too had seen the grotesque comedy of the bear, and that this bid of hers was a kind of prank. She looked, though, as serious as I've ever known my wife to look, her grey eyes flitting back and forth between the auctioneer and the bear itself, her hands still raised. Going to the lady in blue for £12? I didn't understand what was happening. We'd come here for furniture, for useful things to fill our home. This bear was vast, impractical, ridiculous. It wasn't at all the sort of thing we wanted. But then, thank God, an unexpected blessing. Here was another woman, not my wife. Here, in fact, were two other women, one at the back of the hall and one at the front, also raising their hands to make known that they were willing to pay for and take home this bear. Both of these women were, like my wife, over 30, but under 50. Neither was particularly glamorous. One of them wore a hat. My wife turned to me at that point, her eyes sparkling. Should I do it? She said. I'm going to do it. I'm going to win this one. You'll see. I didn't respond in any way. I was too taken aback. The auctioneer called £20, and my wife raised her hand. Then she raised it again at 25. She raised it at 30. She raised it at 35. And yet the other women proved reluctant to yield. I stared at my wife, trying to catch her eye, to signal something of my apprehension, but her gaze was fixed forward, intent on the auctioneer. 40, 45, 50. We by no means had money to burn, being comparatively young and so very new to married life, and yet still my wife raised up her hand. Steady, reliable, her grey eyes clear, and watching the auctioneer with quiet resolution. 55, 60, 65. Eventually, the other two women became intimidated by the strength of feeling that flowed between my wife and the bear, growing stronger with every number uttered by the auctioneer. For a moment, I was almost proud of her, even if it did mean we had to bring back this vast £70 bear to share our home with us. I tried my best to accommodate the bear into our lives, and for a while it wasn't too difficult. We put him in the second bedroom, and since I almost never found myself in there, I rarely saw him. I noticed, though, that my wife sometimes went to check on him, popping her head into that room after breakfast, or excusing herself from the dining table in the hours after supper. We still hadn't found ourselves a sofa. Our appetite for auctions had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She'd go up and sit with him as he sprawled on the bed, his sagging body filling the small mattress. I started to suspect she was tucking him into the covers at night. One Saturday morning in July, when we were sitting on our dining chairs with the newspapers spread out on the table before us, coffee brewing in the pot, and all the windows open on the airless summer day, she said, "Darling, I've been thinking. I would like to see how the bear fits in a different place, if that's quite okay with you. It just doesn't feel right, don't you agree, to have him shut away in that little room where you never seem to go?" It seemed innocuous enough, this idea of hers. We had plenty of space, after all. I agreed, and that very day the bear came out to join us in the rest of the house. She tried him in the living room, where he sat in the corner, lolling next to a vase of dahlias and watching us as we sat at the table and talked in the evenings. It seemed a perfectly fine arrangement to me at first, only a little eccentric if we were to have visitors round. As the long summer days wore on, though, and the bear continued to sit in his corner, my wife often changing the flowers next to him or rearranging his limbs from day to day, I became aware that somehow I was starting to become inexplicably impatient with everything and everyone, particularly when I was at home. I snapped at my wife when she spilt gravy on the table cover, and then when one of my shoelaces broke, I swore so loudly the glass seemed to rattle in the window panes. At first, I thought it must be the summer weather that was doing it, the grueling lack of rain that was turning all the grass to straw and sending mosquitoes whining around our room at night. That is, until one morning, when I looked up from my newspaper to face the round, glassy eyes of the bear, his smiling face flopping to one side as he watched us at the table. And I began to suspect that this new feeling I had was nothing to do with the weather at all. That's all I'm going to read. That's okay.
I'm going to clap. Some forums clap, some don't, but I'm going to clap. Thank you so much, Naomi. That was gorgeous. I look forward to asking more about it in a short while. So our next reader is Frances Leviston. I don't know why it's that different, but it is. Frances, I'm a huge fan of your work as a poet, and I was delighted to see your short fiction come out. So Frances' collection was also published I think 3 weeks actually after Naomi's in this somewhat difficult time by Jonathan Cape. So Frances has 2 poetry collections out already, Public Dream and Disinformation, and they've been shortlisted for many prizes, including the T.S. Eliot and the Forwards. She's currently lecturing at University of Manchester, and tonight she's going to read from her collection. She's going to read a story with all the characters in her stories are called Claire. So like I mentioned about the rats, I also historically don't get along with Claires and Aoifes. And Frances also cured me of my fear of Claire. So I met a Claire in Paris the same week I was reading Frances's collection. So these writers have irrevocably changed my life in terms of rats and Claires. So Frances is going to read her story for about 15 minutes. And then, as I said already, we'll have an opportunity to discuss their stories and their writing and so on. So thanks so much and welcome, Frances.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to read you'll get neither the intrigue of the beginning of a story nor the satisfaction of the ending of a story, because I'm going to read a chunk from the middle of a story called Plight. It's a story about, as Sarah mentioned, all the younger women in my stories, the protagonist of each story is called Claire. And in this case, Claire is a woman in her early 20s who is trying to scratch out an independent life for herself post-university and just about managing it, but still feels very, very involved with her family. So in this story, she has got a bit drunk one night and jumped on a train and gone back to Leeds to see her older brother, who is living in his own house now, but too close to his mother still. And Claire worries about him and she worries about his mental health. So I'm going to read a chunk where kind of Claire is thinking about him and about their other brother, the younger brother. Claire did her degree in art history and she wrote her dissertation on felt and felt making. So there are some little chunks of information about felt making that will sort of pop into the story as well. I should probably give you a trigger warning too. There are references to suicide in this passage.
Thanks, Frances.
Okay. Once upon a time, her plan had been to be the big sibling he had never been for her, the one who breaks the pattern, who shows the way. But coming home from university that first summer, she'd found that Callum's conversation had become so aggressively banal that she could hardly stand to talk to him. It was like he'd sworn off saying anything remotely interesting ever again, as if he wanted to present only the smoothest, sheerest, most purchaseless front. She wished she could say that she had chipped away at this, but she hadn't. She'd felt mulish about it. Fucked if she was going to be interesting for him. When they were kids, everything Callum had said had been amusing. One Easter, they had stayed at a purpose-built holiday village in the Yorkshire Dales, with log cabins, tennis courts, entertainments, a simmering green swimming pool that stank of disinfectant, and perimeter fencing for the safety of our guests that ran between what looked like wooden watchtowers in the trees. "Look," Callum had said, pointing out the towers on the first afternoon. "If we do not participate, we will be shot." All of them had laughed at this, Claire for real, Dean in imitation, her parents with anxious bonhomie. Callum had been off school for 2 weeks, not suspended, not poorly, just off. And there was a force field of nervous tension surrounding him, demanding gentle treatment. Nobody told Claire why. Perhaps other sisters would have pressed to know more, but she was content with the facts she was given, like a cat with its ounce of dry food. She had also been content to collaborate in the story that the force field had vanished once Callum returned to school, even as they all continued to live beneath its shining dome. One of the myths about felt concerned Noah, who herded all the animals into his ark, and these animals, sheep and goats and horses and rabbits and camels and llamas and dogs, all shed their coats and fleeces on the floor and pissed and shat and trampled on them, so that when the ark finally reached land again and Noah herded the animals off, he discovered that the decks were carpeted in a homogeneous mongrel felt. Alone with Callum in his bright raw box of a house, she wondered if this would be the day when she finally raised with him the subject of his pain. It seemed to her that Callum was in pain, chronic, not acute, diffuse, not defined, a deep, unshakable discomfort with himself, from which he had sought relief only in pitiful, disabling ways. Exactly how much pain she could not determine. Whatever it was kept him low, but arrogant. It gave him a powerful sense of self that was composed almost entirely of absences and negations. And it both invited her attention and made him impossible to approach, like rolls of glittering concertina wire on top of a wall. Had she suggested to Callum that he might be depressed, even suicidal, he would have looked at her with pity and contempt, as if she had tried to tell him that his head was on the wrong way around, or had been replaced by something outlandish, a pineapple or an octopus. This was not necessarily a reason to duck the conversation. She might find it reassuring. His scorn was very firm, after all. But she never tried. She never said it. Sometimes she sat there facing him like this over a meal, thinking, I really ought to ask him about it. What if I don't and something happens? But there was a counterbalancing fear in her that saying it would make it happen. Maybe what he remained unconscious of could do him no real harm. Or maybe there was nothing to be conscious of. Maybe he was just a melancholy, ironic person, but not dangerously so. Maybe his closeness to his mother was natural, Claire's distance the unnatural thing. Or maybe, she thought, maybe it was simply that she did not love him after all. You could get to know someone very well and still not love them. Familiarity bred not contempt, but involvement, implication. Love was something else, a free radical, a roaming grace that could not be predicted or deliberately produced. Another myth, that St. Clement and St. Christopher, banished from Rome to the Chersonesus, tucked scraps of breakwool they found caught on thorns along the way into the soles of their sandals and under the straps to stop the pressure blistering their skin. If he was going to do it, he would do it as cleanly and unobtrusively as possible. He would not risk harming anyone in the process. Jumping was out. Hanging was too distressing for whoever discovered the body. Certain pills would have launched him gently downstream without catastrophic organ failure and all its attendant emissions, but he could not obtain them without getting the hospital pharmacist into trouble. Claire thought that he would probably go for the car in the garage. He would know how to tape the length of hose tightly into the exhaust, how to stuff the open window with wet towels. He would put on a CD that he liked, Automatic for the People perhaps, and wait for the nausea to pass. The timing of this abstention would be very important. It would be done at night, when nobody was likely to interrupt, and that night would be in spring, when there were no birthdays on the horizon. All these provisions would be made with a pathological altruism that bore no meaningful relationship to kindness. Claire could imagine it fully, even and including how she might respond herself. Regret would feature largely, not least because of the anticipatory nature of her imaginings. She would have endless corridors of that to walk down, endless recursive self-accusations. How could she be here, projecting all this, and not even try to stop it? It wasn't just an unwillingness to credit her own assessment. There was something else, a deeper sort of helplessness, a code of powerless witnessing that she had been given to absorb, whereby the family had all of them silently pledged not to interfere in one another's pain. Callum was looking at her now, and Claire thought for a moment idiotically that he was going to raise the subject himself, but instead he asked, with an illegible twitch of his mouth, "Have you spoken to Dean?" Dean, the youngest, had refused even to consider university. He said he wanted to be out in the real world, which turned out to consist of ripped films and nightclubs and MDMA and bright white trainers with the laces tucked in, each foreign element an effort to appear less middle class than he was. On Fridays and Saturdays he stayed out all night. He crashed on friends' floors in privately rented ex-council houses on the other side of the city, which his parents knew only because he would phone on Sunday lunchtime and ask to be collected. Claire, when present, had dreaded those talks, the strangled fury they induced in her father, who would wrench the Mondeo out of the drive and zoom off down the road, while her mother wrung her hands and moaned, "Oh, I hope they don't fight." Retrieved, deposited, sullen and reeking, Dean would make himself sandwiches with a whole packet of premium bacon, then retire to his bedroom, which was, by some historical and unremedied accident of allocation, the biggest in the house. That was the problem, Claire thought. They had given him too much room. Even after they bought him a pool table to fill some floor space, he continued to bounce around the walls. Rebellious, they said, rebelling against his dad. But that was still acceptable, could still be understood, because his rebellion had been mounted from within the allegedly rejected sphere. The bays on that pool table had haunted Claire's dissertation. Green grass worsted, glued to planes of wood composite, turning what would have been the sharp sound of the heavy, hurtling balls into a muted rumble that ran down the table's legs and vanished into the floor. The hours they spent leaning on their cues, intent upon, obsessed with the game. The utter infuriation of never being able to strike a ball directly, having always to strike the cue ball first, its ivory colour creating what Claire had taken for an optical illusion, that it was larger than the rest. Then there was the boys' installation at the Pompidou, into which she had stumbled unprepared while her erstwhile friends went in search of Matisse. Plight, it was called. 2 long, low rooms constructed from thick rolls of army grey felt stacked vertically against one another, some bent and fraying apart, showing their soft stuff. She leaned across the plexiglass barrier and taken a breath and felt how the fluff had dried the air. It tickled. It made her cough. But the cough came strangely, as if she had not even opened her mouth, then vanished altogether. A grand piano, shut, stood on the parquet floor, and the very idea of its being played was lost before it could reach her or anyone else, absorbed by the depleted sensorium, in which she had cupped her hands around her ears, buffering herself from the obstinate insistence of a silence not her own. Strange that Claire had fixated on Callum's death wish, when it was Dean who'd actually tried it. 9 paracetamol at the age of 15, swallowed dry in bewildered despair, then confessed as soon as his mother returned from the hospice. She had driven him to casualty, Too late for pumping his stomach, the nurses said, but not to worry, 9 tablets wasn't likely to do real damage. That was what I thought, she'd said to Claire later on, perhaps to the nurses as well. Saving face. It would have been a professional humiliation to arrive with her own son like that, frantic and furious, on the wrong side of the doors. They'd made him eat charcoal and kept him 2 more hours for observation. Then their mother had brought him home again and parked him in the living room, where Claire and Callum and their father were watching GoldenEye on ITV, shifting nervously when the ads came on. Dean sank into an armchair and followed suit. Their mother went straight to the kitchen. Then she stomped back down the hall and put her head around the door. I suppose I'll make dinner, she said, since none of you have done it in my absence. They hadn't, though Claire had popped some popcorn, feeling faintly that this was inappropriate, but wanting it all the same. Now it was after 10. The sound of pans banging mingled with the gunfire on TV. Her mother called them through before the film ended, and they ate together at the kitchen table, not mentioning what had happened, but passing the bowl of flabby broccoli from hand to hand, with a new, embarrassed solicitude that would not last the week. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Frances. Gorgeous. I'll do a clap. I don't know if you can hear me. Thank you so much. I'll give you both a few seconds to reset after your respective readings. But one thing that strikes me from both of your collections that kind of harmonizes is this sense of what we owe people. What do we owe our families? What do we owe strangers? And how these debts are kind of collected and transacted over the course of encounters. Specifically, Naomi, with yours in terms of maybe romantic relationships, and Frances with yours in familial relationships. And that maybe is something I'll just come back to, but I'll ask you separate questions to begin with, if that's okay. Naomi, thanks for your reading very much. I was actually thought of 2 poets when I was reading your work. I don't know if that's helpful or hindrance, but one of them was Merwin, who is a nature poet, and the other was Emily Dickinson. And one of them specifically is a Merwin quote where he writes, "There are men who think they are better than grass." And what I found about your collection, Escapist, is that you throughout it tried to sort of flatten this hierarchy that exists between humans and animals and humans and nature, and even adults and children. In the opening story, it's an adult who sort of thinks he'll get the betterment of a child and ends up being the most vulnerable character as the story concludes. By the way, I'm very renowned for spoilers, so I'm going to try and rein it in. But yeah, I just wanted to ask you more generally how you've kind of nurtured that relationship. I know in a lot of the press around your book, people have honed in on fables, but for me, I really was just struck with nature, and I just wanted you to share with the audience maybe how you've nurtured that relationship over the course of your life and how it distilled then into your writing.
Great, yeah. Firstly, just to say how much I enjoyed Frances's reading. I'm reading her book now and it's amazing. So just to second that, yeah, I'm loving it. Yeah, nature. I think, yeah, just that is something very important to me. I grew up in London, which is possibly the sort of the most it's one of the most urban places on the planet. And I was always this kind of sense of you can't really leave, because I can't even drive. So you're sort of trapped there. And occasionally I get taken as a child to on holiday or something. And you'd be like, oh, I'm in the countryside. But then, yeah, I think as I grew up, I kind of realized that London wasn't the entire world, and that wasn't the sort of default way of being. And I left, after I finished my degree, I moved to Bath just completely on a whim for a bit. And that is another city, but it's a slightly, I don't know if many people know Bath, but it's very small. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so they can't build, I think, both the land around it and the city itself. So they can't sort of expand into the land, and it's sort of, yeah, it's absolutely tiny for a city. And that was like a very reorientation kind of process for me, just living much more close to, they've got all sorts of strange things there, like the Two Tunnels Greenway is a kind of, it's like two old railway lines that run through a kind of like giant hills, like a big hillside, and they've sort of revamped them into a running and cycling path. They were kind of running through this, like literally through rock. And just loads of, I don't know, just that proximity. I definitely had to sort of reorient my perception of the world, and having just sort of stepped off that London treadmill of like, you get your degree and then you go on a grad scheme and then blah, blah, blah. Like I was kind of like, actually, like that's not how it is though. Like sort of existentially, there's something a bit more at work, and the world is a bit more complex than that. And I sort of realized, I felt like I had a lucky escape really, for just seeing it that way all my life. That's a long answer. I also love nature writing, like Robert McFarlane. And
I just was struck by the generosity. Krasna Horkai, who's kind of a complex, maligned writer. People kind of say he's pretentious anyway. He said that sort of human beings think they have won, it certainly doesn't feel like that right now. But in terms of the biological ecology, biology, it was that generosity towards nature. Was there any sort of intention on your, as a writer, to, if we just dip into bear, that's not a real bear. Do you want to tell us how it came about to use an artificial bear, and how it is still a representation of nature somehow?
Yeah, I think that one's probably the least kind of nature-y in a way. Just far and away, I just saw as this kind of, I was literally staying at a friend's house and she had this sort of absolutely hideous stuffed bear. And I was thinking, like, how on earth did that like come into, it was like, I don't know, it's just some family heirloom. And I think I kind of saw the bear as a sort of like metaphor for all the things that are kind of the lack of communication in their relationship, and their sort of feelings of inadequacy, and sort of like that confusion as to like, could I be someone worthy of being loved? Like, surely I'm just this sort of useless, like stuffed object. But yeah, I think that just kind of image, like I love the idea of like animal images and like sort of nature images kind of scattered quite kind of playfully throughout the collection. And I think because, with like childhood as well, there's something about a child's, like it's like a giant, like an out of scale child's toy, and something about that appealed to me. I'm not quite sure why and how, but that was what kind of drew me to there, I suppose.
Yeah, but I guess a child is sort of naive of those distinctions. So that's why I found it so enjoyable, like very, very enjoyable to read. Frances, I'm just going to switch my screen.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your reading. I just want to, you said in an interview that poetry is not a tool to be used, but an intelligence to be collaborated with, and a life of its own. I wonder whether you could just talk us through maybe the transition then from poetry to what short story writing was for you, whether it still held that kind of life of its own.
I think at the best moments it does, or the things that I like most about what I've written. But I think for me there was a huge struggle with structure in getting to grips with writing short stories. A huge difference in approaching it as a technical challenge, as a kind of formal challenge. I think for me, one of the things I love about poetry is that it's unparaphrasable, right? It has to be the words that it is. And I think that largely is true for prose as well, if you're talking about kind of the full impact of the piece of art. But I think nevertheless you can say that, if I summarize the story of a short story, the reader may still receive something that piques their interest, something of a charge. Say I summarize Popular Mechanics by Raymond Carver for you. you'll get something from that summary, in the way that if I try and summarise Tulips by Sylvia Plath, very little of that poem would survive that process. So there is something to do with the form, the structure of a short story that works differently and has more of a life of its own, I would say, than in a poem. So that was kind of a technical thing I was working on. At a very simple level, I think I often arrived at an ending with poetry and knew instantly that that was the right ending for the poem. I have never had that experience with writing any of these stories. I agonized over endings. I would write 10, 12 different endings for every story and keep changing my mind up to the very last minute. So that for me was just a big sign that structurally there's something really different going on there. And I think the other thing I would say for me personally is that often when I am or was writing poetry, it's about an individual consciousness kind of navigating the world, and that's quite a natural state of affairs. Whereas I moved into working on short fiction because I found that I wanted to do more with social being. So I wanted to have more different voices, different characters interacting with one another, conversations, and how do we construct ourselves as social beings. And I know Frank O'Connor said that, you know, short stories are usually about outsiders and loners. And that's very often true, but you have that sense of being outside of something. Whereas I don't think you can say that speakers of poems are usually loners or outsiders. That doesn't really enter into the equation, right? You're just thinking that this is an individual person, you know, having some time in their mind alone, and that's perfectly normal. So I was pushing up a little bit against that wanting to write about family relationships, say, particularly in my last book of poems, but I'd reached the limits of what I could do with that, I think, in poetic form, so I started to work on stories after that. It's been really hard. I felt like I was like a total beginner again, and I had to sort of learn everything again. But I think that was, well, it's what you have to do, isn't it? When you move forms, you just have to figure out what you can do with this new form, and let it sort of kick your ass for a while.
It kind of circles back to what I said about sort of debt and credit, and sort of, was there anything that you could transfer? Was there any kind of credits in your allowance that you could transfer from the poetry, or was it really ground zero? Is it sort of...
No, I think I love sentences. I've always loved sentences as a poet. I very much enjoy writing poems that might even be one single sentence all the way through, or that make use of that kind of complicated questing sentence structure. So I think I felt that I came to writing prose with a pretty good handle on what I could do syntactically.
Yeah.
That's probably too crafty an answer again.
No, really, like that really comes across. They're like incisions. They're very like, yeah, they're extremely sort of tight, and that really does come across. I'm glad that you said that. Yeah. I mentioned in our little pre-meeting that I might ask about a reader as well. You both seem very concerned with, because you're both concerned with form, that leads me to suspect that you're very concerned with maybe the seriousness of a reader, or sort of what the responsibility of a reader is. And often at festivals, and actually a lot in the press, Frances, you'll know this from poetry, that a lot of poets are asked, what is the role of a poet in society? But I'm with you now, Frances, so I'll ask you, and then I might ask Naomi the same question. But what is the role of a reader in society, or what do you feel like your duty is as a reader?
I mean, there are so many different kinds of reader that that's a really tricky question, and I think I'm very conscious when I'm writing that what I'm writing is not, it's never going to have mass appeal. There are a lot of readers out there who just won't be interested because they're not interested in poetry, or because it's not uplifting, or whatever. I don't know.
What to narrow it down? What's the hard work that you do as a reader?
As a reader, yeah. So I can only really answer. That's what I'm saying. I can only really answer it in terms of myself. I think trying to understand what a book is doing on its own terms, okay, and not to project onto it too much, not to judge it by something it's not actually trying to do. Yeah. I would say that's one thing. And and to, what do I think? I think to be open to what you're reading, which, I mean, that's part of not judging it and prejudging it too much. But I think to allow yourself to be challenged and to be changed by what you're reading, and not to come in with too many defences up. That's my answer today. It'll probably be something else tomorrow.
Absolutely. And just one added question. Martin Amis, in a slightly affirmative or confident tone, said that he was Saul Bellow's ideal reader. Are you? Yeah, I won't make any comment. But are you anyone's ideal reader, do you think? Is there anyone in the world?
Apparently I'm my partner's ideal reader.
Oh, okay.
My partner is a poet, so
Paul Batchelor, right?
Apparently, yes. Apparently I am his first reader. We're trapped in this house together in the middle of nowhere, so he has to give me everything.
Thank you. I know that's a slightly opaque question. You've been very patient with me. Naomi, you've had time to gather your response.
Yeah, well, I loved Frances's answer. I think that sort of judging a book on its own terms is incredibly important. I love reading like genre and loads of like schlocky sci-fi and fantasy. Schlocky, that's a judgmental word. Like, yeah, and it's not, it's not trying to be a certain thing, and it's trying to do something else. And you have to, you get so much more pleasure out of books, I think, if you take them on their own terms. I think also, like, I've just become, being shut in a house throughout this last 6 months, become kind of very just irritated by the world sort of frequently, and by the sort of like the snap, as I'm sure a lot of people have, the kind of snap assumptions and the lack of nuance, and the kind of lack of patience that a lot of people have, it will seem to have. I think when you actually leave the house and speak to people have, aren't like that. But when you're on social media or sort of reading the news or watching presidential debates in America, there's a kind of incredibly everything's flattened out. And I do think that with reading, and I notice it as a tendency in myself as well, I'll be reading for work, and I'll be sort of racing through something and trying to summarize it in my head before it's done, and trying to sort of flatten everything out so I can be like, oh, I can recommend that book to someone. It's this, and this in 3 words. And then I sort of have to do that for publicity myself, sometimes in my own books. And yeah, I think reading is a great sort of vehicle for like empathy and nuance and patience, and a way to sort of really engage with the complexity of ideas. So as a reader myself, I think that's something I always try and sort of make sure that I'm doing as a sort of antidote to a lot of forces going on in the world at the moment, maybe.
Absolutely. And are you anyone's ideal reader, to borrow from Martin Amis?
Oh, I think that's sort of different from like whose books do you love. I read because I used to be a bookseller, and I think that I went straight into bookselling straight after graduating. So I feel like I developed a kind of extremely all over the place kind of reading taste, because if you've got an entire bookshop and you have to recommend to every single kind of customer, it's a kind of great crash course in sort of becoming a reader of many different things. So I wouldn't say so. I like mixing it up a lot.
You worked at Mr. B's Emporium, didn't you? Just a shout out to them, because they're an amazing bookseller.
Yeah, they are. If anyone's in Bath, go to the Emporium. Wonderful.
Absolutely. I wanted to borrow from Frances's title, and I'm going to revert back to Frances as well. But The Voice in My Ear. The issue of our parents and sort of, it came up last night briefly when I was talking to a writer, Kathy Sweeney. We were exploring she writes wonderful stories that explore a lot about sex and stuff. I sound very Irish saying that, sex and stuff. The sex, but yeah, no, the voices in our ear, depending on our sensitivity levels as individuals. I'm a highly sensitive person, clearly because I've transposed my phobia of rats and clares onto your books. But in terms of the voices in our ears, yeah, who are the voices in your ears in terms of, as a writer, in terms of who's looking over your shoulder, or who's sort of, let me go back into more detail. It can be very difficult to write about things like family and parents, and it's something we see come up a lot with autofiction, with sort of the fallout of people like Knausgaard and things like that. But yeah, who are, in the positive sense, who are kind of the voices in your ear when you're writing, when you're making things?
Well, it depends what I'm writing. I've found that so I've done 3 books now, and from each book it's felt like I've had sort of presiding spirits or something, writers I've been really, really interested in at the time when I was working on those books. So with The Voice in My Ear, I was reading loads of Alice Munro and loads of Flannery O'Connor. And I think sort of learning from both of them, taking what I could from both of them, there is some sort of the dark humour and sort of grotesquerie in the book, I would say, and some of the portraits of some of the characters are, they're not all likeable people. And I think some of that comes from just reading Flannery O'Connor and seeing how much she just embraced the sort of the human mess and nastiness, and all that. Her characters are all these sort of wounded souls in purgatory, just colliding with each other in really horrible ways, and just causing more and more damage. And I guess that resonates in some way with my worldview. And then Alice Munro, I think, is just I mean, she's a genius, but she is a genius at evoking what can't be said without ever being explicit, but you feel it. You feel it, you get it, it's right there, you understand it, but nobody says it. And she has a collection called Open Secrets, which I think is sort of brilliant on that, the title story especially. But I think that was something I was interested in. I think when we're writing about family, often we're writing about things that can't be said, because you're not supposed to think them and you're not supposed to feel them. So she was very useful for me in that way too, as well as just generally being an amazing technician as well, the way her work is constructed. So I think if you're thinking about influences and things, which I guess is one of the things I think about with The Voice in My Ear, those two were definitely, I was trying to invoke them or summon them or something when I was writing. And there's always that awful voice saying that this is no good, and you may as well just stop and go back to writing poems, but even those weren't that good anyway. You know, that kind of, that very critical voice that we're all dealing with. And then the voice which is your slightly better self saying to her, come on, you can do this. And like, you're stuck in the middle between those two, and trying to get some work done. Yeah.
Did you ever go down the road of sort of trying to write like them, and finding really that you were, there's a wonderful interview, many wonderful interviews, but there's specifically, we have a laureate, fiction laureate, Sebastian Barry. I don't know if his tenure is up, I may stand corrected, but he did a series of really wonderful craft interviews, and one of them was with Kevin Barry, the novelist and short story writer, and he said that he started out wanting to write the Jewish novel of Cork, that he wanted to write like Philip Roth and these New York and he put it much better than I am right now. But yeah, was there a sense where you sort of, I know, because I know a lot of writers are watching that, where you were hovering around those kind of influences? Did you, how did the amputation occur? You know, the voice of Frances and the voices.
I don't know if I can answer that. I think I definitely was, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with imitation as a way of getting going. Yeah. And I think as far as influence is concerned, I feel like the only way is through, like, you have to just give in to that voice and let it kind of come over you and write some terrible things that are really slavishly copying somebody else before you get through to what it is of their work that you can use. And I think that's been my experience with poems as well. So that's, to answer your earlier question, maybe that's one of the things I took with me into writing fiction, is like not being afraid of finding people and really hanging on to them,
just having a chat with them.
There are lots of kind of abandoned earlier things I was trying to write that are just imitations of both of those writers and others. I don't know. I don't know what it is, and I feel like it's so early for me in fiction writing as well that I'm not sure I have done that yet. So it's hard for me to see if I've got something that's actually my own yet or not.
It doesn't feel early. It feels very punctual to me. It feels right on the money. So it's a wonderful book. Naomi, can I address the same question to you about the voices in terms of, who gets you through the night and who's gotten you through this whole period and in your life as a reader? I've read many interviews where you talk about how much you cherished reading as a child, but
Yeah, well, I think this collection, I actually wrote it, it's sort of odd talking about it at the moment. I wrote it two years ago, I think now, and I have another book coming out in the spring, which feels kind of much more like my voice. And I think all the voices in this book, it's kind of like it is what it is, right? And it sort of captures a time, but I think a lot of the different voices were me sort of trying out different things and sort of discarding them. So there's this kind of gothic fairy tale that runs through the whole middle thing. And I think I grew up reading lots of like Neil Gaiman and China Miéville and Angela Carter and those kind of writers, and kind of wanted to write my big like Forbidden Planet opus, and that kind of got out of control. And then like with Bear, I was like at my MA and I was reading lots of like Donald Barthelme and being like, ooh, like sort of simple like building structures and like, finely crafted male voices. And I don't know. And I think it was very, each one is me sort of trying, like the one you were talking about earlier, the sort of one set in Ireland actually sort of feels quite, I don't know where that came from. But yeah, a lot of them were me trying out different things. But yeah, recently I've been, I think what Frances said about guiding spirits for each book or for each story definitely feels like both with writers and with people I know. I think with each of the books, like there are sort of just real humans that were kind of in my life at that time or around that definitely feel like I'm sort of writing sort of in concert with or writing to, or I was watching the event last night with Leslie Tenorio, and he said something. He was like, my fiction isn't like autobiographical, but it's like emotionally autobiographical. And I thought that was really good. And I was like, yeah, that is kind of it. And those sort of guiding spirits of the people that are kind of informing your work as you write it. I think there's a kind of those relationships, whether there's anything in the book that sort of literally resembles them or not, there's some kind of essence of them, some kind of emotional truth that comes from just sort of humans, friends, colleagues, teachers that happen to be around at the time.
Like an energy field rather than a sort of node or something. You're working on a novel, Naomi. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm very excited about it. I'm nervous as well. So I've been working on edits sort of throughout lockdown, and proofs sort of, I'm told, coming out next week, I think. And it's that stage, when you've been sort of editing something for ages, you have no sense of what actually ended up in the book and what it actually is. So I don't know how much has sort of come through in the actual thing between the two pages. But I'm excited to sort of, I might just read it like a book myself and see. But yeah, it is my guiding spirits while writing. I was reading a lot of like Tim Winton and like James Kelman and Colin Barrett, just creative disparate. But like Julia Darling as well, an amazing short story writer. And it's about, I need to get better at telling this.
It's actually a very horrible question. I slightly regret asking it, but no,
it's about friendship, basically.
We want to read more of your work. Yeah, please.
It's about friendship and solidarity. It opens in 2003 with two young boys in sort of a town in Surrey, and they meet on a common, and one of them is a kind of fairly, he's a sort of boy from suburbia, and the other one is a Romany gypsy, and they become sort of fast friends at that point, and it sort of follows them throughout their life and into sort of young adulthood, just exploring the different social structures in place that kind of put various stresses and strains on their friendship, and sort of friendship across cultural boundaries, I'd say. Was my aim. We'll see how much came through.
You're very fluent at that. I like this sort of leaking, sort of overlap and stuff. And first of all, I was very defensive. I was like, this is set in Ireland, hang on. As any Irish person would be. We're not known for being subtle or sort of modest. And I was blown away. So anyone watching, I was blown away by your story. It really was. So it's a profit and a credit to Ireland. So thank you for writing it.
So glad.
Not at all. Frances, we're drawing towards the end, but I can't let you go without asking a question. I underline quite a lot in your book, and also, of course, it's gone somewhere now, but it is about altruism that bore no relationship, a pathological altruism that bore no relationship to kindness.
Yes.
That kind of blew me away. It's something I study the very sticky topic of empathy, and my theory is not very developed, but is that sort of the short story is like a stranger, and the novel is more like a friend. I know that's a bit babyish at the moment, but the idea of this thing that I keep on hovering over is sort of what we owe each other. It's very, very pregnant now. When you consider that we all are coming together with this pandemic, and we're all, it's a huge question, a general question. What do we owe each other? Do we owe each other wearing masks? Do we not? And this, can you tell me a little bit about this sentence? Because I just think it's magic.
I really like that you. Thank you for picking. I like that sentence too, but nobody's ever mentioned it to me before.
Oh,
so
you're all awful.
It's nice. It's very rare when your own favourite bits coincide with somebody else's.
Oh.
I suppose one of the things that I'm really writing about in that collection is what mothers owe daughters and what daughters owe their mothers specifically. And I would. There's a question of who has control of the narrative of the family, and who has control of the narrative of individual lives, particularly of the children in the story, in sort of the story of a family. So I guess with these stories, I'm interested in a moment when a person decides to try and take charge of their own narrative, and that may be in tension with a narrative that's being given to them, or has been given to them, or that they have been content to go along with for some time. And I think there is I say this very carefully, because this is what one of the things that's going on in the stories is that there is a narrative that the mothers in the stories are completely giving and loving, and they do anything for their family. And one of the questions that the daughters in this book are asking is, what if I don't want you to do anything for me? Why is it not okay for me to say that I don't want you to do anything for me? There's a story called Broderie Anglaise about a young woman who is trying to make a dress for herself, and her mother interferes. And the girl can't do it. She's not managing it very well. So the mother is offering helpful assistance, but there's something just impossible about that for her. So I think that trying to draw a line between altruism and kindness is just trying to think about what are the intentions behind a person's kindness, and if kindness isn't wanted, is it still kindness, or is it an imposition, I suppose. Those are some of the things that the stories
really right. But it's also really important to introduce I don't particularly go in for it because I tried doing his cold showers for a couple of mornings. The guy who tells you to take a cold shower, you know, Wim Hof, he says, go to the cold or the cold will come to you. And I I think that about you and Naomi's stories, you know, go to the ugliness or the ugliness will come to you. Go to the grotesquerie or it will come for you.
Definitely.
And there is such bravery in both of your books where it's making and holding space for these kind of less savory emotions. And is there hostility to kindness? Is there control in kindness itself? I really, it just brought up so many interesting questions, both of your works.